They show up after the sighting, after the questions, after you get just a little too close to something you were never meant to understand, dressed in black, speaking in dead, flat tones. They don't ask for silence. They make you feel like silence is the only way you'll survive.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
When you hear Men in Black, you probably think of the popular film from the 1990s. A fun science fiction romp with a little bit of horror imagery. But imagine this. You witness something impossible in the sky. Maybe it's a strange craft. Maybe it's a light moving in ways no aircraft should. You tell a friend, you call a reporter, you keep a photograph, a scrap of metal, a note in a file, and then, not long after, there's a knock at your door. Standing there are men in dark suits. Their clothes are immaculate. Their expressions are blank. Their questions are precise. And somehow, they already know far too much about you. For decades, witnesses across America have reported encounters with these figures, the so-called Men in Black. Some say they were government agents sent to suppress UFO reports. Others insist they were something far stranger, beings only pretending to be human and not quite getting it right. Their skin looked wrong, their voices sounded rehearsed, their eyes, witnesses say, were sometimes so piercing they felt less like eyes than instruments. Tonight, we follow the trail of one of the most enduring and unsettling legends in paranormal history, from the earliest UFO-era panic to terrifying modern encounters, including a hotel incident in Niagara Falls that some believe may have captured these mysterious visitors on camera. The stories are bizarre, the fear is real, and if even part of it is true, then somewhere in the shadows, someone may still be making sure certain secrets never see the light of day. So get comfortable and make sure you're subscribed as we tell that story tonight. In October of 2008, staff at a hotel in Niagara Falls said their security cameras recorded something unsettling. Two tall, identically dressed strangers walked through the lobby doors, both wearing impeccable black suits, long coats, and old-fashioned fedoras. They moved in unnerving lockstep. Employees later recalled unnaturally pale faces and eyes that seemed to bore in to anyone who glanced their way. More than one person described the pair as looking exactly alike, like twin silhouettes, cut from the same uncanny mold. The men asked for a specific manager by name. When told he wasn't in, they lingered in the lobby, and corridors, speaking quietly about government secrets and leaving employees deeply unsettled. By the time the staff regrouped, the visitors were gone. That grainy CCTV clip has been circulated online as a rare visual tied to Men in Black lore, but the phenomenon itself lives mostly in witness reports. For decades, people across the world have described encounters with similar dark-suited figures after witnessing strange lights in the sky or digging into UFO reports. Unlike the charming Hollywood versions, these real-world accounts paint the visitors as ominous and sometimes deeply bizarre individuals who arrive unannounced to pressure witnesses into silence. We're going to go on a guided journey through some of the most famous and unsettling Men in Black cases, starting from their shadowy roots and building back to that modern encounter said to be caught on camera in Niagara. But here's the question that makes it even more than a spooky costume. Are these visits evidence of an organized intimidation pattern, something human and bureaucratic, or are we watching a folklore contagion that spreads the moment a community starts hunting for answers? We're going to tell the story as it's been reported, then we'll pause at key moments to separate what's documented, what's disputed, and what remains unknowable. The legend of the Men in Black began as early as the dawn of the UFO age. One of the first known encounters occurred in June of 1947, just days after the modern flying saucer era began. In Washington state, a harbor patrolman named Harold Dahl claimed he saw strange disc-shaped objects in the sky over Maury Island, followed by a rain of metallic debris that damaged his boat. The very next day, Dahl was approached by a man driving a brand new black sedan. Dressed in a dark suit, the stranger invited Dahl to a local diner, where he somehow knew every detail of Dahl's sighting. In a calm but firm tone, he warned Dahl never to speak of the incident again. Dahl took the warning seriously. He later reported that the man implied terrible consequences would befall his family if he didn't stay quiet. This frightening meeting is often cited as the first encounter with what would come to be known as the Men in Black. A few years later, a far more influential case would cement the phenomenon's place in UFO lore. In 1952 and 1953, Albert K. Bender, a Connecticut researcher, found himself at the epicenter of a series of bizarre events. Bender was no ordinary UFO enthusiast. He was the founder of the International Flying Saucer Bureau, one of the world's first major UFO research groups. He ran his organization from the attic of his stepfather's house, a space he had transformed into his personal chamber of horrors. The dim attic was decorated with faux skulls, monster masks, and occult imagery, and dozens of clocks ticked at all hours. Bender loved a good scare, but in the autumn of 1953, he encountered a terror beyond even his imagination. Late one night, as Bender pored over his notes, he was overcome by the stench of sulfur wafting through the attic. Before he knew it, 3 men materialized in the room. They were dressed in black suits and hats, their faces largely obscured by shadows. Years later, Bender would insist these visitors didn't walk in through the door. He claimed they simply appeared. In low voices, the trio made it clear that Bender's UFO investigations had to end immediately. They knew all about his research and publications. One of them even collected copies of Bender's newsletter, Space Review, as the room's lone light bulb dimmed and flickered. Terrified and convinced he was in real danger, Bender shuttered his entire organization shortly after the encounter. In the final issue of Space Review, October 1953, he printed a cryptic message. Quote, "We advise those engaged in saucer work to be very cautious." The implication was unmistakable. Something, or someone, had scared the leading UFO researcher of the day into sudden silence. Bender's experience spread quietly at first, shared in hushed conversations among fellow researchers. It wasn't until 1956 that the wider public learned of it, when writer Gray Barker published a book titled "They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers." Barker, who had corresponded with Bender, presented the story of sinister visitors in black who pushed him to stop. In Barker's book, the phrase "men in black" appears in print, giving a name to these shadowy enforcers. From that point on, the idea of mysterious men sworn to silence UFO witnesses began to take root in the popular imagination. Whether that name captured a real pattern or helped create one is part of the mystery. Little did anyone know, Bender's tale was only the beginning. Albert K. Bender's shutdown of the International Flying Saucer Bureau is a documented moment in early UFO history, but the most dramatic details of the three men encounter largely come through later retellings and secondary accounts. Gray Barker helped popularize the story in print, and his work is often criticized for blending reportage, rumor, and showman flair, which matters, because the Men in Black idea may have grown in the retelling. Keep that tension in mind. A real research community, a real sudden silence, and a legend that might have been shaped by the very people spreading it. Through the 1960s, as UFO sightings swept the United States, whispers of the Men in Black grew more frequent. It seemed that wherever extraordinary lights or objects were reported in the sky, the black-suited strangers might not be far behind. In West Virginia during the winter of 1966 and 67, amid the famous Mothman sightings, locals in Point Pleasant spoke of odd visits from unknown men. A journalist named Maury Island, who was covering the strange occurrences, was unnerved by a small man in a black suit and thick glasses that came to her office. He claimed to be from out of town, asking puzzling questions about her articles. As he peered intently at her, he bluntly inquired, "What would you do if someone told you to stop writing about flying saucers?" Heyer, shaken by the encounter, felt that this was implicitly a warning, and she wasn't alone. Others in town reported 2 or 3 government-looking men in black suits going around to witnesses, also urging people to forget what they had seen. The pattern was becoming clear. someone or something was systematically trying to snuff out UFO reports at their source. Around the same time, a case in Ohio offered an even more alarming example. In 1967, Robert Richardson of Toledo told authorities he literally collided with a UFO while driving at night. The mysterious craft was nowhere to be seen after the crash, but Richardson managed to retrieve a small piece of metal from the scene. Just a week later, 2 men in a shiny black sedan showed up, unannounced, at Richardson's home to question him. They were polite, but persistent, wanting the piece of the wreckage. When Richardson informed them he had sent the metal off for analysis, their demeanor changed. One of the suited men leaned in and issued an unmistakable threat. If Richardson wanted his wife to stay as pretty as she was, he'd better get that metal back. Startled and furious, Richardson demanded identification, but the strangers claimed their credentials were secret and promptly left. He never saw them again. Richardson was left fearing not only for his own life, but for his family's safety, a fear that became a common refrain in many Men in Black encounters. In 1968, another bizarre episode hinted that the enforcers were keeping tabs on prominent UFO researchers. Jack Robinson, a New Jersey enthusiast, began noticing a mysterious man lurking near the entrance to his apartment building in Jersey City. The man was tall, pale, and always wore a black suit and hat. Day after day, Robinson's wife Mary saw the figure loitering there, staring up at their window as if watching their every move. Soon the Robinsons realized their apartment had been subtly ransacked. Files rifled through, objects moved, as though someone had been searching for something while they were out. Convinced they were being stalked, they mentioned it to a friend, Timothy Green Beckley. Beckley decided to see for himself. One day he drove over, and sure enough, the strange man in black was standing on the sidewalk in front of the building. Summoning his courage, Beckley snapped a photograph of the lurker. That grainy photo, allegedly showing a thin man in a black coat and fedora on a city street in broad daylight, is one of the only known images of a supposed man in black. Not long after, the mysterious stranger stopped appearing, but the Robinsons had little doubt about who had been creeping around their home. The incident reinforced what many in the UFO community already suspected. The men in black were not just spooky anecdotes. They were an active, ongoing phenomenon. By the end of the 1960s, the term Men in Black was well established among UFO circles, and reports of these intimidating visitors had popped up across the country. Often the stories shared common traits. The men arrived in groups of 2 or 3, always unannounced, often driving pristine black cars. They typically came right after a sighting hit the news or a researcher dug up a promising lead. They would flash vague credentials or claim government affiliations that could never be verified, and they invariably pressed witnesses to drop the subject of UFOs entirely. While many victims were too frightened or embarrassed to go public, the legend of the Men in Black continued to grow through quiet, ever-widening whispers. Even as the UFO craze of the 50s and 60s settled into the cultural background, the men in black did not disappear. On the contrary, encounters continued into the 1970s and beyond, sometimes involving highly respected people, even celebrities. In September of 1976, for instance, a soft-spoken doctor in Maine named Dr. Herbert Hopkins allegedly received one of the most unnerving visits on record, a case we'll delve into later. Around that same decade, other ufologists whispered about odd late-night phone calls with nobody on the line except strange electronic noises. Calls they suspected were Men in Black intimidation attempts. The phenomenon had become ingrained enough in the public mind that by the time Hollywood produced the Mothman Prophecies in 1975, based on the book by John Keel, and later the blockbuster Men in Black film in 1997, audiences were already familiar with the concept of ominous, suited figures silencing the truth. Of course, the real Men in Black stories were anything but lighthearted. Perhaps one of the most startling modern encounters came from someone who himself was world famous, but not for UFOs. In 2002, actor and comedian Dan Aykroyd was working on a television documentary series about the paranormal, tentatively titled Out There. Aykroyd, known for his role in Ghostbusters and an avid fan of UFO lore, had interviewed several experts and experiencers for the show. One brisk winter day in New York City, during a break in filming, Aykroyd stepped outside the studio to take a phone call. As he tells it, while on the phone, he noticed a tall man in black standing across the street, staring intently at him. The man was dressed in a classic black suit and hat and stood next to a shiny black car. Aykroyd looked away for a moment. Some say it was because he was startled, others because his phone rang again. But when he glanced back, both the car and the mysterious man were simply gone. The very same day, Aykroyd received word that his TV show was being inexplicably and abruptly canceled. The series was scrapped before a single episode made air. Aykroyd later recounted this experience publicly, firmly believing that he'd been brushed by the Men in Black, and that someone, somewhere, did not want his UFO investigations broadcast. The unnerving incident served as a reminder that the modern era was not free from the reach of these dark phantoms. Through the late 20th and early 21st century, credible encounters with the Men in Black remained relatively rare, but persisted just enough to keep the mystery alive. A handful of UFO researchers claimed they were followed on lonely roads by black cars that seemed to appear and disappear at will. Others told of unsettling face-to-face meetings with strangers who somehow knew personal details that no outsider ought to know. Each story added another layer to the mythology. But beyond anecdotes and a few blurry photographs, hard evidence remained elusive, at least until that day in 2008, when a hotel security camera allegedly captured two of these men on video. Before we revisit that compelling final case in detail, it's important to understand what exactly people claim the men in black look and act like. Over decades of reports, a remarkably consistent picture has emerged. In the many tales of men in black confrontations, the beings are consistently described in ways that are as fascinating as they are frightening. Imagine a person who, at first glance, seems human. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in a conservative black suit, white shirt, and a dark tie, often with a fedora-style hat perched neatly on the head. They almost resemble undertakers or government agents from an old movie. But the longer witnesses look, the more something feels off. Something about them is not right. First, there's the physical appearance. Witnesses frequently mention that the men in black have unnaturally pale or olive-tinted skin, sometimes described as like plastic or dead white. Their faces tend to be devoid of normal human quirks. They often have no facial hair at all, no stubble, no 5 o'clock shadow, no eyebrows or eyelashes. Many have reported that the men's hair, if visible under their hats, appears to be artificial, like a wig. In one encounter, a terrified hotel clerk noted that the men's identical black hair looked almost glued to their heads. Some say the skin on their cheeks and hands appears oddly smooth or lacking any imperfections, more like wax than living flesh. And then there are the eyes. Accounts vary, but a number of witnesses recall the men in black having oversized, unblinking eyes that are strangely light in color, sometimes a vivid blue. Those eyes may be covered by dark sunglasses, but when the glasses come off, they can be downright hypnotic. One woman swore that a man in black's piercing blue gaze literally made her mind go blank, as if he could somehow control her thoughts. Next is the manner of speaking and moving. The voices of the men in black are often described as monotone or mechanical, as if the speaker is unfamiliar with basic human inflection. They speak flatly, choosing odd phrasings and sometimes using outdated or overly formal language. A common observation is that their speech sounds as if someone learned English from a textbook or an old film and never quite mastered the nuances. In the 1976 Hopkins case, for example, the visitor spoke in a slow, emotionless cadence and repeated certain stock phrases over and over, as if by rote. Witnesses sometimes note long, uncomfortable pauses in conversation and a tendency of the men in black to interject peculiar, almost nonsensical small talk, like commenting on a mundane object with intense curiosity. One famous account from the 1960s described a man in black who was fascinated by a ballpoint pen, as though he had never seen one before. Their movements, too, can be peculiar. Many say the men in black walk in a stiff, deliberate way, almost as if they're unfamiliar with the act of walking itself. They rarely show any warmth or emotion. Smiling is typically absent. When they do attempt it, it comes off as forced and uncanny. deeply unsettling. It's not unusual for witnesses to describe an aura of strangeness around these beings. People report feeling a sort of electric tingling or a sense of dread moments before a knock at the door heralds their arrival. Sometimes pets react with panic or aggression in their presence, as if sensing something fundamentally not human. In Albert Bender's case, the overwhelming smell of sulfur and a sudden chill in the air preceded the appearance of the 3 dark figures in his attic, an omen that he interpreted as a sign of otherworldly evil. Perhaps most disconcerting is the way the men in black tend to end their encounters. Just as quickly as they appear, they often depart in an unnatural fashion. After delivering their warnings or making their cryptic inquiries, they leave swiftly, frequently driving off in spotless black cars that seem antique or out of date, yet brand new in condition. The classic image is a large black Cadillac from the 1950s or 60s, gliding away without a sound. In some stories, the cars themselves turn a corner and then are simply gone, as if they evaporated into the ether. Other times, the men walk out the door, and moments later the witness checks, only to find nothing but an empty street. It's almost as if these entities can dissolve into the shadows from which they came. All of these consistent details, cloned looks, odd speech, impeccable attire, and seemingly paranormal comings and goings, have led to wild speculation about the true nature of the men in black. Are they covert government operatives, part of some ultra-classified bureau tasked with quashing UFO evidence to prevent public hysteria? Or could they be something far stranger? Perhaps alien beings, or humanoid robots attempting to mimic humans and not quite getting it right. While theories abound, one thing is certain. For those who encounter them, the men in black are the embodiment of the uncanny. They appear human, but everything about them radiates an air of deep wrongness. Threats, implicit or explicit, are the hallmark of the men in black, and this is where their method of operation comes into full, frightening focus. These mysterious figures don't just look strange, they engage in behavior clearly aimed at scaring people into submission. From the earliest cases to the more elaborate confrontations, intimidation is their weapon of choice. Consider again Albert Bender's predicament. He was a man so enthusiastic about UFO research that he rallied hundreds of people into joining his organization. Yet, one visit from the men in black was enough to make him abandon the pursuit entirely. Bender never publicly detailed exactly what the 3 men told him that night in his attic. He saved the full explanation for a later book, which itself raised more questions than answers. But the effect was obvious. He was thoroughly spooked. The message delivered was effectively, "Stop what you're doing, or else." Bender's immediate compliance and his dire published warning to fellow UFO researchers illustrate just how profoundly these dark visitors could unnerve even the most passionate of believers. Many others have received similarly dire warnings, In Ohio, Robert Richardson faced a pointed threat about his wife's well-being if he didn't hand over his piece of UFO evidence. Richardson had encountered something extraordinary and wanted to investigate, but the men in black made it personal. They let him know they could hurt those he loved. That kind of intimidation strikes at a person's most vulnerable spot, and it worked. Richardson, fearing for his family, quietly backed down, and the mysterious metal fragment he'd found was never seen again. Another classic example of Men in Black harassment comes from the UFO flap in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s. Reporters like Maury Island and the author John Keel, who was investigating the Mothman sightings as well, were inundated with strange phone calls at odd hours. Sometimes a voice described as vaguely foreign or mechanical would deliver a menacing line and then hang up. One such call to Maury Island simply stated, "We know what you have seen, and we know that you have talked. You'd be wise to stop." These communications were accompanied by face-to-face visits from those odd, threatening gentlemen in the dark suits who made similarly veiled threats. Heyer was so disturbed that she began to keep a gun in her desk. Keel, in his accounts, described feeling constantly watched and noted that many locals clammed up about their sightings after being visited. The pressure was palpable and effective. No case of intimidation is more famous, however, than that of Dr. Herbert Hopkins, the quiet physician and hypnotist from Maine mentioned earlier. In the autumn of 1976, Hopkins was studying a UFO encounter as a consultant, delving into a case of alleged UFO teleportation. One evening, while his wife and children were out, he received a phone call out of the blue from a man who claimed to represent a New Jersey UFO research organization. The caller had heard of Hopkins' work and wanted to discuss the case, saying he was in the area. Hopkins agreed, perhaps flattered or simply curious, and gave the man his address. He hung up the phone and went to switch on his porch light, only to find the caller already walking up to his door within seconds. Hopkins later admitted his blood ran cold at that moment. Somehow, the man had arrived almost instantaneously when the nearest payphone was miles away. Inviting the stranger in, Dr. Hopkins quickly realized something was terribly off about him. The visitor wore a neatly pressed black suit and a tie, with a black hat, which he removed to reveal a completely bald head. In the soft light of the living room, the man's skin looked disturbingly pale and smooth, almost like plastic. Hopkins noticed the man had no eyebrows and no eyelashes. Even more oddly, the stranger's lips were a vivid red, as if he were wearing lipstick. In fact, at one point the man brushed his mouth with the back of a gloved hand, and a portion of the lipstick smeared, revealing a ghastly lack of any real lips underneath. As Hopkins' heart pounded, the man began asking questions about the case Hopkins was investigating. His voice was flat, emotionless, but he displayed an uncanny knowledge of the details, as if he already knew the answers to the questions he was posing. Each time Hopkins responded, the man would echo, "Yes, that is how I understand it," over and over, the exact same phrase, like a tape recorder on loop. Then the encounter turned from strange to terrifying. The man in black politely asked Dr. Hopkins to take a coin out of his pocket and hold it in the palm of his hand. Puzzled but compelled, Hopkins did so, producing a shiny penny. "Watch the coin," the stranger requested. Hopkins did, and to his shock, the coin started to glow, then blur at the edges until it simply disappeared. The man then said no one on this plane would ever see that coin again. He calmly steered the conversation to the famous Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction case, asking the doctor if he knew how Barney Hill had died. Hopkins replied that, as far as he knew, Barney had suffered a heart attack. The man in black's response was delivered with an icy finality. "No, that's not exactly true. Barney Hill died because he knew too much." Dr. Hopkins understood that message loud and clear. It was a threat. His own research, the stranger was implying, could lead to the same fate if he didn't stop immediately. The blood drained from Hopkins' face. At that point, the visitor's speech began to slow, and he struggled to rise from his chair. "My energy is low," he said, each word slow and toneless. "I must go now." Unsteadily, the man made his way to the door and disappeared into the night. Hopkins, recovering from the shock, rushed to the window to watch the stranger's departure. He expected to see a car pulling away. Instead, he saw a bright blue light bathing the driveway, and then nothing. Just the darkness and an empty road. The man in the black suit was gone. In the wake of that encounter, Dr. Herbert Hopkins was so shaken that he immediately halted all of his UFO research. He even erased the tapes of the hypnotic sessions he'd been conducting on the teleportation case, effectively burying the information the strange visitor had been so curious about. It wasn't just what the man in black had said, it was the utter strangeness of the whole experience that convinced Hopkins this was no mere prank or ordinary threat. Quote, "If it had been just a man telling me to stop, I might not have," Hopkins admitted later. "But because of the high strangeness of it all, I complied." Hopkins felt, as many others have before him, that he had been confronted by something truly beyond the normal, something that could not only threaten him, but defy the very laws of reality. The intimidation was complete. To this day, Hopkins' story stands as one of the clearest illustrations of how the men in black supposedly operate. They show up uninvited. They scare the living daylights out of people using both words and inexplicable tricks. And then they exit. Mission accomplished. Witness silenced. The Hopkins encounter is one of the most cited Men in Black stories because it plays like a perfect short horror film. A stranger, a coin, a threat, and a hard stop. But most versions trace back to Hopkins' own account as repeated by UFO writers later down the line, and details can shift depending on who's telling it. What's consistent is the pattern. An experiencer feels observed, then intimidated, then encouraged to disappear from the conversation. Whether that pattern is an external force or an internal pressure cooker is exactly what we're weighing here tonight. Across countless accounts, this pattern repeats in varying forms. Witnesses are frequently told one way or another to drop their involvement in UFO investigations or stay quiet about what they saw. Sometimes the warning is delivered with a smileless calm, other times with overt menace. There are cases where the men in black hinted or even claimed outright that they could cause car accidents, make people disappear, or inflict harm if the person didn't comply, and whether by paranormal means or plain old fear, they usually succeed. People often heed the warning. They stop reporting, stop researching, or significantly tone down their public statements about their experiences. After all, who would want to invite another visit from these terrifying strangers? For all the frightening tales of the men in black, one thing is always in short supply: evidence that holds up outside the campfire circle. That's why the Niagara Falls incident in 2008 hit UFO forums like a lightning strike. As the story is told, it began with reports of strange lights over the falls, and then, not long after, a pair of men in black appearing at the hotel, with at least part of the encounter said to be captured on security video. Later, Sovar pieced together what happened from the accounts of his employees and a review of the security footage. The hotel's bellman had been the first to encounter the strangers. He described them in almost cartoonishly unsettling terms. Both men were extremely tall, well over 6 feet, and exactly the same height. They wore identical black suits, black dress hats, and even black sunglasses while indoors. Their skin was chalky pale, and their faces were so alike they could have been twins. Moving in uncanny unison, the pair asked, in the bellman's words, a bunch of questions about Sovar, who was their apparent target. When told the manager wasn't available, the two men exchanged knowing glances and began to roam around the lobby and adjacent halls, as if searching for him, or perhaps for something else. A front desk employee later recounted the encounter in hushed, trembling tones. She said these visitors were very, very scary. They spoke to her about things like governments and conspiracies in a way that made no sense, as if making bizarre small talk. But their voices were what frightened her most. Cold and flat, completely devoid of warmth or inflection. She noticed they had no eyebrows or eyelashes at all, and that their unnaturally smooth black hair might actually have been wigs attached to their hats. At one point, she found herself transfixed by the men's eyes, visible just behind their dark glasses. Their eyes were a piercing, almost electrifying shade of blue. There was something hypnotic about them. She even confessed, tearfully, that she felt as though the strangers could read her mind. In a panic, she tried to think of anything other than the hotel or her boss, desperately hoping to block whatever mental intrusion she imagined was happening. Before leaving, she also observed one detail that sent a shiver down her spine. Neither man appeared to blink. Not once. After two strangers eventually left, the shaken staff immediately called Sovar to tell him what had transpired. Understandably skeptical yet alarmed, Sovar rushed to review the security camera footage from that day. What he found astonished him. On the grainy black and white feed, he saw exactly what his employees had described. 2 tall figures dressed in black suits and hats striding through the front entrance, side by side. Even on video, there was something uncanny about their identical movements and appearance. They passed under the lobby camera, briefly scanned the room, and headed out of frame as if on a mission. Strangely, Sovar found no footage of the men leaving the building, only the segment showing their arrival. It was as if they disappeared inside the hotel. How they came and went without being caught on multiple other cameras remains a mystery. When the paranormal investigation team that Sovar had originally reported the UFO to learned of this incident, they went public with the story and released the lobby footage online. The video quickly made waves in UFO and paranormal circles. After all, it was touted as possibly the first real video evidence of the legendary Men in Black. Here, finally, were 2 of these figures caught on tape for the world to see. They looked exactly as decades of eyewitnesses had described. Tall, pale, identical, and ominous in their old-fashioned black garb. The Niagara Falls footage and witness testimonies revitalized interest in the Men in Black phenomenon. Some viewed it as a smoking gun, proof that these mysterious agents truly exist. Others were more skeptical, suggesting it might have been a hoax or simply 2 peculiar salesmen with unusual fashion sense. However, the emotional accounts of the hotel staff, the genuine fear in their voices as they recounted the men's bizarre appearance and behavior, were hard to dismiss. These were ordinary people with nothing to gain from concocting such a story. In fact, Sovar himself chose to stay mostly out of the limelight after initially sharing the evidence, perhaps wary of drawing any more attention from the dark-suited visitors. The Niagara story is compelling because it involves a specific place, a specific date, and a video people can watch. But even there's footage doesn't automatically mean there's proof. The key questions are mundane but crucial. Who controlled the original video? What exactly is visible on it? And what can be independently confirmed about the manager's report? And how much of the tale comes from retellings after it went viral? Treat it like an investigation. The clip is a clue. The claims around it still need verification. So, what can we conclude after this journey through the strange world of the Men in Black? We've followed their trail from the first quiet threat in 1947 through the silencing of Albert Bender in the 1950s, the nationwide scare of the 1960s, and up into recent decades where even an A-list actor and a hotel security camera got a taste of their haunting presence. The pattern is unmistakable. Whenever curious eyes turn toward the unknown skies, the Men in Black just might materialize, ready to ensure that some secrets stay secret. They arrive without warning. They sow fear and confusion, and then disappear as quickly as they came, leaving us with more questions than answers. Who or what are they really? Some believe they are clandestine government operatives, part of an invisible bureaucracy that polices the UFO phenomena and keeps witnesses quiet. Others suspect they might not be human at all, but extraterrestrials or other entities in disguise, using human-like bodies and behavior as a cover, albeit imperfectly. The way they mimic humanity, but not quite well enough. Their odd speech, their mechanical mannerisms, their eerie knowledge, suggests beings trying to play a role that they don't fully understand. And there are those who think the Men in Black are a little of both. Perhaps aliens working in tandem with shadowy government agencies, blending deception and otherworldly abilities to conceal truths we aren't ready to learn. In the end, even with circulating clips, blurry photographs, and decades of first-hand stories, the Men in Black remain an enigma. They are phantoms in the world of ufology, sometimes seen, often felt, but never held still long enough to measure. And maybe that's the point. Whether they are agents, archetypes, modern folklore, or a shadow cast by our own need for answers, the effect is the same. Silence, fear, and the sensation that someone is listening, just out of your sight. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com. And produced by Dan Wilder. With original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.